You've found just stories, simple, heartfelt moments from real lives, stories that remind us how connected we all are through love, loss, and hope. Get cozy. The stories are about to begin. A little Timmy perched on a bench in the park, his gaze wandering over the stream of people walking by. The park was full. Some strolled leisurely along the paths, while others hurried as if chasing an unseen goal. It was a human flow, multifaceted and noisy. There were children too, tiny tots, teenagers, and others like Timmy. Adults, be they mothers, fathers, grandmothers, or grandfathers, held the little ones tightly by the hand. Timmy had also come to this park with his mother. Before that, they had traveled a long way by train. For the boy, it was his first such journey. Never before had he seen these giant, steaming steel machines, from which came a strange, yet somehow pleasant smell. At the station, he had even felt a slight fear at the unfamiliar sight. "What are you, a girl?" Uncle Mick chuckled, noticing how Timmy involuntarily flinched from the train. "Your mother said she gave birth to a son." Uncle Mick caused Timmy a persistent aversion. This man, always loud, with unkempt stubble and a gloomy disposition, seemed to the boy the embodiment of everything unpleasant. But his mother, it seemed, harbored tender feelings for him. She hugged him, kissed him, stroked his hair, and tried to please him in everything. Timmy couldn't understand what could be found attractive in this man. When Uncle Mick first appeared in their apartment with his mother, he initially even appealed to the boy, for he brought a cake, sweets, juice, and a bouquet for his mother. The house filled with a sense of celebration, and Timmy loved celebrations. The man stayed to live with them in their small apartment with creaky floorboards and wide windowsills. Timmy adored his home, so old, so painfully familiar, wooden, two-story, with neighbors who were invariably kind to the boy. He didn't understand why the adults called it an old barracks and complained about the need for demolition. Why? Where would we go? It's so nice here. It's the best place in the world. Timmy once declared to his neighbor, old Mrs. Gable, who often chatted with the curious little boy and treated him to something tasty. She laughed so hard that tears came to her eyes, and then suddenly grew sad and hugged Timmy tightly. Mrs. Gable was good, very kind. The boy missed her on this trip, although his first adventure in life brought him joy. Uncle Mick didn't like Mrs. Gable either. She called him a tyrant, a drunkard, and a good-for-nothing. Timmy didn't quite understand the meaning of these words, but by the way the neighbor pronounced them, he felt they were something very bad, and the boy shared Mrs. Gable's opinion. With Uncle Mick's appearance in their apartment, his mother's old friends stopped visiting. And it was for the best, because they would sit in the kitchen all night, making noise, laughing, often arguing, and even fighting. At such moments, Timmy would crawl under the bed, fearing he might get hurt. It was scary and unpleasant, but Uncle Mick drove everyone away. Calm reigned in the house. But, alas, not for long. The man turned out to be much worse than his mother's previous friends. He would yell at his mother and Timmy, constantly express dissatisfaction, and demand unquestioning obedience. And then people started coming to the apartment again. Only now they were Uncle Mick's friends, just as gloomy and angry as he was. Timmy was afraid of them, very afraid. He imagined these people were capable of harming him or his mother. Sometimes Uncle Mick would put Timmy out the door saying, "Go play, you're annoying," and lock it behind him. The boy would try to explain that it was cold outside or raining, that he would sit quietly as a mouse in his room and not bother anyone. But Uncle Mick was relentless, and his mother agreed with him in everything. So the boy would wander for hours in the empty yard. It was good if Mrs. Gable met him and took him to her place. The old woman's apartment was clean and always smelled delicious. And although Timmy loved his own home, looking at Mrs. Gable's bright rooms, the little boy understood that their apartment was in eternal disarray. At the neighbors, empty bottles didn't lie in the corners, and there was no dust, dirt, or trash on the floor. Along the walls stood cabinets full of books. Timmy loved looking at the pictures in them. Mrs. Gable even started teaching him to read. Progress was fast. The boy was already putting letters together into words. It seemed like magic. Incomprehensible symbols suddenly acquired a completely concrete meaning. But the learning process had to be interrupted. "We're leaving here tomorrow," his mother announced one day. "I've already packed." "There's nothing to pack there anyway," came a hoarse voice from the next room. It was Uncle Mick responding. "Where are we going?" Timmy asked. "To a better life," his mother answered vaguely. "Somewhere everything will be completely different." That night, Timmy couldn't sleep. Excitement wouldn't let him rest. A multitude of thoughts crowded his little head, and anticipation of a miracle settled in his heart. Something special, completely new, was about to happen. The unknown was a little frightening, but the changes still brought joy. In the morning, it was hard to wake Timmy. "Get up now, or we'll leave, and you'll stay here," bellowed Uncle Mick, watching his mother's futile attempts to lift her sleepy son from the sofa. Timmy immediately jumped up. He understood. Uncle Mick wasn't joking or threatening. He was truly capable of such a thing. He would do it. The station greeted the boy with a colorful, alluring crowd. Timmy held his mother's hand tightly, although her hands were full of bags. The little boy was very afraid of getting lost in this endless human flow. And then they went out onto the platform, and the eyes of the astonished child beheld the train. Huge, steaming, bright, and menacingly puffing like a red-hot iron. Mrs. Gable. No, that wasn't right. The boy was seeing a real locomotive for the first time. Of course, there were pictures of trains in Mrs. Gable's books, but an illustration was one thing, and seeing such a machine live was quite another. The train simultaneously frightened and fascinated him. "Why are you gaping like an idiot?" Uncle Mick roughly nudged the frozen Timmy. "Let's go," his mother agreed and moved towards the train. Inside, it was even better than Timmy could have imagined. Uncle Mick and his mother settled on the lower bunks, and he was placed on the upper one. From there, it was very convenient and interesting to observe life in the carriage, and what views opened from the window. Timmy even fell silent for several hours, which didn't happen often. Forests, fields, and villages flew by. It turned out the world was so vast, so beautiful. How he wished he could wander through those groves, throw stones into the rivers and lakes flashing by the window. And sometimes, on neighboring tracks, oncoming trains passed, passenger and freight. The most interesting ones were those carrying machinery. Timmy liked the clatter of the wheels. It was calming, promising adventures and joyful encounters. When it got dark outside and his mother told him to lie down, Timmy lay and listened to this rhythmic sound. It lulled the boy, tired from new impressions, to sleep. In the morning, Timmy was woken by the train's long whistle. At first, the boy didn't even understand where he was and was a little scared. Then he remembered everything, smiled, hung his head down, made sure his mother and Uncle Mick were sleeping on the lower bunks, calmed down, and stared out the window again. The train was speeding through unusually picturesque hilly terrain. The landscapes were captivating, making his tiny heart contract with delight. Timmy suddenly felt a strong desire to take an album and pencils and try to draw this beauty. Only he had neither an album nor pencils. All that had stayed with Mrs. Gable. It was she who gave him such things, while his mother and Uncle Mick thought children shouldn't be spoiled and that a child of 4 years old still couldn't draw anyway. After some time, the adults woke up. The three of them slowly had a snack of bread and sausage and drank tea from glasses in silver holders. It was very tasty. And then the boy was ordered back to the upper bunk. "And sit there quietly," Uncle Mick warned, "or someone will notice you and kick you off. You don't have a ticket. You're riding for free." Timmy was scared by these words and obediently took his place. He liked being on the upper bunk, but the boy's legs were already stiff. He really wanted to walk around the carriage, see who else was traveling, meet someone, maybe even run a little in the narrow corridor. Only Uncle Mick had made it clear he couldn't, and if he didn't obey him, Timmy didn't even want to imagine what would happen. After some time, the train stopped. Timmy looked out the window. They were at a crowded station. Probably they had arrived in some big city. "Let's take a walk," his mother suddenly suggested. "Let's stretch our legs a bit. The stop is long. We have time. Get some fresh air." Excellent place, Uncle Mick approved. Timmy was very happy. Finally, he would go outside. He wondered what kind of city it was. What were the people like here? What were the streets like? Now everything would become clear. It was good that Uncle Mick wasn't coming with them. Timmy liked walking with his mother, just the two of them. But lately, that hadn't happened often. And now, unexpected joy. At the station, his mother bought Timmy a delicious jam pastry. The boy walked, holding her hand tightly, and looked around with curiosity. What a nice place. Passers-by smiled at the big-eyed little boy. The sun shone brightly from the sky. Sparrows chirped. "Oh, to stay here forever." Timmy sighed dreamily. His mother smiled strangely. Then they came to a park. There were so many interesting swings, so many wonderful slides. In his own city, Timmy had never seen such splendor. "Can I?" he asked his mother, looking at the bright playground. "Of course," his mother nodded. She sat on a bench opposite and waved her hand as if to say, Go and have fun. I'll wait for you here." Timmy rushed to the playground with all his might. He rode on carousels and swings, went through rope mazes, and bounced on the trampoline. His delight knew no bounds. What happiness that he and his mother had gone for a walk in this wonderful city. There were many children around. They were laughing and having fun, chasing each other. Timmy joined first one group, then another. No one chased him away. On the contrary, they were happy the boy had come. And rightly so. The more people, the merrier. Finally, Timmy felt very tired and missed his mother. Besides, he was hungry too. He wondered how long he had spent on the wonderful playground and why he hadn't been called yet. It was time to go back. The boy ran to the bench where his mother had been sitting. But the bench was empty. On the next bench, two old women were comfortably seated, watching their grandchildren. On the next one, a man with a stroller. There were no more benches near the playground, and his mother wasn't there either. How could this be? Where was his mother? What had happened to her? Maybe she had just gone to buy water or a pastry and would come back now, and even laugh at Timmy for being such a scaredy cat, just as long as she didn't tell Uncle Mick, or he would tease him about being a girl again. The boy settled down next to the old women, who paid him no attention, so engrossed were they in conversation. His mother had been sitting on this very bench, the neighboring one, so she would come back here. How else? Time passed. The old women called their grandchildren and left. The other benches also emptied. There were hardly any children left on the playground. Evening was falling. But Timmy still sat as if glued, waiting for his mother. He was cold and hungry. He was very scared. Adults hurried past on their errands. Timmy tried to spot a familiar, so dear face in the crowd. But deep down, the little one began to understand. His mother wasn't coming. Something terrible had happened, something incredible. Maybe his mother was lost? Or had that wicked Uncle Mick come and taken her, ordering Timmy to stay here? His mother always obeyed him. What should he do? It was so scary, so cold, so lonely. And the people no longer seemed as friendly as they had in the morning, and the sun no longer shone so brightly and welcomingly. Even the playground brought no joy. Look, all the swings were free now. Sit on whichever you want, you didn't even have to queue. But he didn't want to at all. And suddenly the boy caught sight of something familiar in the crowd. No, it wasn't his mother. An elderly woman was walking slowly along the path, very similar to Mrs. Gable. Not so much in appearance, but in her expression, her walk, her mannerisms. For some reason, tears welled up in Timmy's eyes just then. This woman couldn't be wicked. She, like Mrs. Gable, would help him in a difficult moment, tell him what to do next, support him, calm him down. The boy jumped off the bench and ran up to the stranger with the kind face. He couldn't delay. What if she walked past now and got lost in the crowd? "Hello, Auntie," Timmy greeted her first thing. Mrs. Gable always said that politeness could conquer cities and told her little neighbor about the importance of good manners. "Well, hello there, little one." The woman looked surprised, but very kindly. Her eyes were as blue and radiant as Mrs. Gable's. This discovery gave Timmy confidence. "Do you happen to know where my mommy is? I'm already very cold and I want to eat, and she's still not here." A flicker of alarm crossed the woman's face. She knelt down in front of the boy so their eyes were level. "Little one, are you lost?" "I don't know, honestly," Timmy replied. "But I think it's not me who's lost, but Mommy. I stayed where she left me, but she's just not anywhere." Eleanor Thompson lingered at the clinic. Her blood pressure had been fluctuating lately, so she had to visit periodically. "Age. What did you expect?" the local doctor would say, throwing up her hands and prescribing more medications and tests. Age. Yes, she wasn't a girl anymore. A whole year in well-deserved retirement, it was hard to believe. Eleanor Thompson had worked as a seamstress her whole life. She worked multiple shifts at a large factory, toiled at private enterprises, and took orders at home. Very difficult times were in the past, when there wasn't even enough for bread. Eleanor Thompson still remembered the despair of those days. It was precisely then that the incident occurred for which the woman blamed herself her whole life. Sometimes it seemed that her conscience was at peace, that she had managed to convince herself that there was no other way. But then the guilt returned and pressed with renewed force. Outwardly, Eleanor Thompson remained calm and even cheerful. No one suspected the heavy thoughts churning in her head. She and her husband rarely talked about what had happened. Eleanor Thompson suspected that he too suffered greatly inside. At least, a hidden sadness was often visible in her husband's eyes. Of course, such a thing was impossible to forget. These were the difficult 90s. Eleanor Thompson was constantly at work, working 2 shifts. She would crawl home in the evenings, tired and exhausted. The young woman's legs, back, and arms literally ached from fatigue and overexertion. Her eyes teared up. They paid mere pennies for this work, and even that was regularly delayed, citing the difficult economic situation. "No one is keeping you here," the director would tell all the dissatisfied. "If you don't want to work, write your resignation. There's a queue for your spot, rest assured." And it was true. Enterprises were collapsing one after another. People were left without means of subsistence. Eleanor Thompson understood that she couldn't find work in the city and therefore endured. She worked overtime, came in on weekends. She arrived home squeezed dry like a lemon. And in the small apartment they rented from a very principled old woman, their 2-year-old Claire was waiting for them. By the time Eleanor Thompson returned, her husband usually managed to pick up the little girl from kindergarten. The man had recently lost his job, a promising engineer now moonlit in the evenings, sometimes driving a taxi, sometimes unloading trucks, sometimes helping on construction sites. He hadn't been laid off, but finding a new job was very difficult. Her husband had even given up on his qualifications, looking for an electrician's vacancy. His education allowed him to work in this field, but times were such, work was impossible to find. So he got by on odd jobs. The young couple's parents couldn't help the family. They themselves were barely surviving and were elderly. Both Eleanor Thompson and her husband were late children in their families. The situation was more than desperate. But Eleanor Thompson remembered those times even with a kind of nostalgia. She and her husband were young and loved each other very much. Then it seemed that everything would settle down, that the financial difficulties weren't forever. Their beloved daughter was nearby, delighting them with new achievements every day. And most importantly, they hadn't yet committed the act for which they now felt guilty. Their conscience was absolutely clear, which is why life was easier and calmer then, despite the financial troubles. Eleanor Thompson remembered well the day she found out she was pregnant again. She hadn't been feeling well lately. At first, she dismissed the alarming symptoms, attributing them to lack of sleep, nerves, and poor nutrition. But then she finally went to the doctor after work. "You're pregnant," the doctor delivered the verdict after the examination. "And already 13 weeks. It's strange you didn't notice earlier. It's not your first time." Eleanor Thompson sat as if struck by lightning. Of course, she knew something was wrong with her body, but she attributed it to stress, hard work. Without hesitation, the woman immediately wanted to schedule a termination. She remembered perfectly how happy she had been about the news of her first pregnancy. Now, however, Eleanor Thompson felt only fear. She clearly understood that their family, on the verge of survival, couldn't afford another baby. Somewhere deep down, the woman desperately wanted to be a mother again, to experience that wonderful feeling once more. But now it was impossible. "What termination?" the doctor asked tiredly, irritation on his face. "Did you hear the term I said? It's too late, you'll have to give birth." Eleanor Thompson barely made it home. Tiny hammers pounded in her temples, burning tears welled up in her eyes. A mix of feelings fought in her soul, from joy, strangely enough, to despair, and also thoughts. They performed a frantic dance in Eleanor Thompson's head. Her subconscious was furiously searching for a way out of the situation. Find a folk healer who could help get rid of the fetus? That was scary. That was dangerous. Try to work from home to provide for the growing family? Unreliable, problematic with a big belly, and then with 2 babies in the house. Eleanor Thompson was so absorbed in her thoughts that she started crossing the road on a red light. An indignant car horn brought her back to her senses. She had to pull herself together, share the news with her husband. He was a man. Let him decide. Eleanor Thompson clearly remembered the look of fear and despair that appeared on her husband's face when he learned about the pregnancy. She probably looked the same herself at the doctor's office. "Well," her husband said uncertainly, "since it happened this way, we'll have the baby. What can you do? I think I found a job in a workshop. But what kind of workshop? Just a guy in a garage reupholstering furniture. Plus, I'll work nights. We'll manage somehow, since it happened this way." Her husband hugged Eleanor Thompson, trying to cheer her up. And then he got ready and slipped out of the house. A freight train was arriving at the station today. Porters were needed. The woman felt sharp pity for her husband. An excellent specialist, an outstanding mind. He was invaluable at his research institute, so many awards, so much respect, and now a porter and an apprentice. It was upsetting, and this child, because of him, both of them would have to work even harder. But then little Claire whimpered on the floor. Usually she could play with her toys for a long time, and suddenly tears. The woman touched her forehead. It was hot, and Eleanor Thompson attended to her daughter. All other thoughts and problems receded for a while. This second, unwanted pregnancy was very difficult. Eleanor Thompson often felt unwell, nauseous, dizzy, dark spots flickering before her eyes. All this, of course, affected her work. Firing a pregnant woman wasn't easy, but the director forced her to write a resignation letter. "I don't need workers like you, constant sick leave, not meeting quotas. If you don't write it yourself, I'll fire you for professional incompetence, and then you won't find work anywhere with such a black mark." There was even less money. Her husband, of course, tried very hard. He worked at the furniture reupholstery workshop, took any odd job, but it was desperately not enough to live on. And now a baby would appear soon. Eleanor Thompson felt nothing for the infant stirring under her heart. She had awaited her daughter with love and joy, talked to her, sang her songs. But she considered the younger child a burden, determined to ruin their lives. She scolded herself for such thoughts, but couldn't help it. And only just before giving birth, when it was time to prepare the infant's layette, Eleanor Thompson softened a little, because she was sure that this time she was expecting a son. And so she sewed him several wonderful blue suits and jumpsuits, stitched diapers with airplanes. Looking at all these tiny things, the woman felt some warm feelings for the belly dweller for the first time. That's what her husband jokingly called the baby. He, at least, was eagerly awaiting his arrival, making plans, even managing to be happy, although he was very tired from his jobs. The baby was born on a stormy November night. In between painful contractions, Eleanor Thompson heard gusts of wind hitting the windows and cold rain drumming. Finally, a wrinkled, crying red creature was placed on the exhausted woman's chest. "A boy," the midwife reported indifferently and hurried to another woman in labor. Eleanor Thompson looked at her son and couldn't understand her feelings. She had expected that upon seeing the little one, she would be filled with tenderness for him. That's how it was the first time. But now the woman thought only about how to feed and raise this extra mouth. The baby was taken away. She was sent to a ward. Eleanor Thompson sank into sleep with pleasure. She was very tired, both physically and emotionally. And in the morning, sad news awaited her. After the babies were brought for feeding and taken away, a doctor came into the ward. She said a few words to each mother about their babies, but asked Eleanor Thompson to come to her office in half an hour. The woman froze. She understood that something was wrong with her child. Otherwise, why such special attention? At the appointed time, Eleanor Thompson entered the chief doctor's office on stiff legs. "Please sit down." The woman in the white coat smiled tiredly, gesturing towards the armchair in front of the desk. "It turns out the newborn boy has serious heart and kidney problems. He needs treatment, lifelong treatment. The medications exist, but they are expensive." "We have no money at all," Eleanor Thompson stammered, growing cold. Yes, she hadn't fallen in love at first sight with the newborn, but he was her son. And the news of his illnesses was a cruel blow. And then, expensive medications. Where would they get the money for them if they were barely making ends meet? The doctor began to talk about funds that helped families in such difficult situations. It turned out there were also sponsors in the city who supported sick children. But you had to ask, collect documents, knock on every door. "A way out will be found. The main thing is the desire," the tired woman in the white coat assured the shocked mother. It was easy for her to say. She hadn't given birth to a sick child. And then there was the discharge, and the difficult life began with a sick newborn and a capricious 3-year-old, and all this under conditions of family financial disaster. They decided to name the son Arthur. The name was chosen by her husband. That was his great-grandfather's name. The ancestor was known for excellent health, lived almost to 100 years, and all that time was in his right mind and on his own feet. The man believed that the name would help the new Arthur to become healthy and strong. Eleanor Thompson didn't object. Arthur it was. It made no difference. She herself had no desire to think about a name for the boy. The child turned out to be very restless. He cried a lot, slept little, and ate poorly. Claire, jealous of her mother towards the new family member, became completely unruly, constantly whining and demanding attention. Eleanor Thompson was going crazy with all of this. But the most important thing was Arthur's health problems. They were confirmed at the children's clinic. It turned out that the situation was even worse than initially thought. The child required lifelong therapy with expensive medications. Charitable foundations partially paid for the medications, but still, a large part of the family budget now went to treatment. Eleanor Thompson understood perfectly that Arthur was not to blame for anything, but she still practically hated this tiny tormentor for all the difficulties he brought to their family. Eleanor Thompson didn't recognize herself. She had always believed that the defining traits of her personality were kindness, mercy, compassion. How could a woman who previously couldn't walk past a hungry kitten without feeling something think like this about her sick, tiny son? But you can't command your feelings. It was only later that Eleanor Thompson understood and analyzed her state at that time. A difficult pregnancy, the preceding work in multiple shifts, lack of money, the child's serious diagnoses, lack of help, lack of prospects. All together led to a severe condition, and this was very serious and required treatment by a specialist. But who thought about professional psychological support in those difficult times? Survival was the priority. Anyway, after a year it became clear. The family was no longer able to bear the burden of a disabled child, neither morally, nor materially, nor physically. Eleanor Thompson was the first to suggest a way out. "We can't cope with Arthur," she said to her husband one evening, looking him seriously in the eyes. "It's obvious he's getting worse. We can't even buy him medicine. We're constantly saving on everything, denying ourselves everything, shortchanging Claire, and we still can't cope." "I'm trying." Her husband lowered his eyes. He didn't even argue. It was obvious his wife was telling the truth. "You're trying, I see. You'll break down soon. You're not made of steel. And then we'll be completely lost. This can't continue like this. Something needs to be done urgently. I think we should give him to a special institution. At least there they'll provide him with medication. I checked. The treatment of orphaned children is paid for by the state budget. To an orphanage? Are you suggesting we give up our son? Her husband looked at his wife with eyes wide with horror. Unlike her, he clearly felt warm feelings for Arthur. He talked to him, played with him, constantly smiled at the boy, carried him on his back when he had a free moment. Of course, that didn't happen often. Work took up most of his time. Well, what's the alternative? Eleanor Thompson burst out. Watch him slowly fade away before our eyes? Spend all our money on a hopeless treatment, depriving Claire? For all of us to starve? And for his sake? Her husband didn't answer then, but Eleanor Thompson saw he was seriously considering her words. Rationally, the man understood that a seriously ill child was indeed beyond their means right now. But deciding on such a desperate step was difficult, very difficult. In this, Eleanor Thompson understood him. Arthur had already turned 1 year old. He remarkably resembled his mother in appearance. Large blue eyes, light curls, a slightly upturned nose, an incredibly sweet child, simply an angel from a postcard, only very thin. Perhaps his appearance would work in Arthur's favor, and he would find wealthy parents for whom the amount needed for his treatment was mere pennies, and he would have a happy, prosperous, long life. But they themselves couldn't handle Arthur. It was obvious. Rental housing, lack of stable work. Arthur wasn't the kind of child you could send to kindergarten at 2 years old and return from maternity leave. He needed constant attention and supervision. No employer would agree to continuous sick leave. And it was terrifying to think what would happen to the child without the necessary therapy. They couldn't provide him with adequate treatment. So Eleanor Thompson saw only one way out. At first, her husband tried to take control of the situation. He found another part-time job, didn't come home for days hoping to provide the family with everything they needed. But in the end, he too understood that it was time for decisive action. Eleanor Thompson remembered that morning well when she and her husband arrived at the orphanage. The special institution was located in a neighboring region. The couple had arranged everything with the director in advance, so the family was expected in the office. They were met by a middle-aged woman with very anxious eyes. Looking at her husband, who was tenderly holding Arthur close, she clarified, "Are you absolutely sure? There won't be hysterics, tears, accusations against us later?" "Yes, we've thought it all through. We have no other option," Eleanor Thompson replied confidently. She wanted to get the difficult procedure over with quickly. The little boy smiled, happy to be going somewhere with his mom and dad, looking at Eleanor Thompson trustingly. It was unbearable. "All right then," the director sighed. "The papers are ready. Please review and sign. The child will be taken now." At these words, the father instinctively held Arthur even tighter. Eleanor Thompson also reached for the little boy, but stopped herself. It was decided it would be better this way, for them and for their son. Soon, only the adults remained in the office. Arthur was taken by a nurse. She managed to cast a judgmental glance at Eleanor Thompson. She bore it quite calmly. Anyone who hadn't been in such a situation had no right to blame them for anything. Well, then life went on as usual. To avoid questions from neighbors, the couple rented another apartment in a distant district. Eleanor Thompson went back to work. Life seemed to get easier. But the thought of the little boy left in the orphanage, of course, couldn't help but torment both parents. Husband and wife tried not to talk about their action, silently stewing in their own experiences. Every day, Eleanor Thompson found many arguments for such a decision. Arthur was receiving necessary treatment, they were raising their older daughter properly, not depriving her of attention or material comforts, her husband wasn't slaving away at several jobs at once. He looked like a human being again, not a tormented zombie. It was better for everyone this way. And yet, at night the woman often couldn't sleep, constantly trying to imagine what Arthur's life was like in the orphanage. Was he well fed there? Was he mistreated? Or maybe a wealthy family had already adopted him long ago. Her husband also suffered, tossing and turning sleeplessly beside her, but he remained silent. The man tried to lose himself in work. The furniture reupholstery workshop gradually grew into a large firm. He had to work tirelessly, but the money was good. Things were also going well for Eleanor Thompson at work. And in general, the economic situation in the country had changed significantly. The family had money. Over time, the couple could afford an apartment. Their own, not a rental. And then they bought a car. Now they went to the sea every summer, something they couldn't even dream of before. Sometimes Eleanor Thompson thought that if Arthur had been born now, the thought of giving him to an orphanage would never have crossed their minds. Now they could buy their son all the necessary medications and even afford expensive surgery. Apparently, her husband had the same thoughts, because one day when Claire was sound asleep in her room, he decided to have a serious talk. "How old is our son now?" 10 years old, almost 11, the woman answered quietly. In all the time that had passed since visiting the orphanage, the couple hadn't often dared to talk about the boy. Claire didn't remember at all that she had once had a brother. I was thinking, what if we could take him back? Yes, I think about it constantly, but I'm afraid, will he forgive us? Will he understand? Besides, he's probably been adopted long ago. So you're not against it? Relief shone on the man's face. I've been thinking about it for a long time. I just didn't know how to talk to you. Of course, I'm not against it. This wild feeling of guilt has tormented me all these years. The woman finally admitted her feelings and immediately felt relief, as if a weight had been lifted from her soul. Claire, how do we tell her about this? Right away tomorrow? Let's tell her. Just find the words. She might react in who knows what way. She's a teenager after all. Eleanor Thompson pondered. Claire often asked her parents for a brother or sister, but after what they had been through, the couple couldn't even think about another child. And now, at such a sensitive age, their daughter would suddenly learn about her mom and dad's terrible act. How would she react to it? It was terrifying to imagine. Let's not tell her anything yet, Eleanor Thompson decided. First, we'll go to the orphanage, find out the situation, meet Arthur, and then we'll see. They didn't postpone the trip. The very next weekend, the couple got in their car and drove to the neighboring region along the same road as 10 years ago. They told their daughter they were visiting her father's friend. The orphanage hadn't changed at all over the years. Perhaps there were more swings and slides in the yard. The director was the same woman who had spoken to the bewildered couple then, on that terrible day that divided their lives into before and after. She recognized them immediately. "I remember you," the woman stated, looking at the visitors. "You left a boy here. It was about 10 years ago, I think. Your story is unusual. That's why I remembered it. Usually we get children from troubled families. A case like yours is rare. We would like to take our son back." Eleanor Thompson got straight to the point. "Is that so?" Confusion flickered across the director's face. "We were living below the poverty line then," the husband began to explain. "We couldn't provide for the children properly, and Arthur also needed treatment. That's why we took that step. Now things have improved, and you decided that the orphanage was like a temporary shelter for the child? A bad situation? You handed him over to the state, then you changed your mind and just took him back?" The director didn't hide her irritation. "You shouldn't judge us without having been in our shoes," Eleanor Thompson warned. She wanted to say much more to this arrogant woman, but didn't. Angering her now would be foolish. They were too dependent on the orphanage director. "You won't be able to take your son back. He's not with us anymore." "Where?" Eleanor Thompson jumped up. "Where is Arthur now?" "I cannot tell you that," the director replied dryly. "And now please leave my office." "Why won't you tell us? Is it adoption secrecy?" "Just give us a hint," the father pleaded, convinced he would leave the orphanage with his son. "Leave the premises," the woman repeated in an icy tone. "Otherwise, I will be forced to call security. First they abandon a child, then they demand him back." There was nothing they could do. The couple left the office empty-handed. On the porch, a nurse approached them. A plump, elderly woman with kind, sad eyes and an amazingly wrinkled face. "Are you Arthur's parents?" she asked with sympathy, looking at the bewildered visitors. "Is it you who left him here because you couldn't afford to treat and feed him?" "Yes, that's us. We are those villains," the man replied. "Well, why villains? Don't listen to our director. She's awful, terrible, a bad person." "Do you know anything about Arthur?" Eleanor Thompson looked at the nurse hopefully. "Of course I do," the old woman sighed sadly. "And the little boy was his mother's spitting image. The same blue eyes, the same light hair. That's who he got his good looks from. What happened to him? Where is he?" "I have no good news for you." The nurse lowered her eyes. "He's not alive. His heart gave out 4 years ago. Didn't make it to the hospital, so the expensive medications didn't help." The ground went out from under Eleanor Thompson. The woman stumbled. She almost fell. Her pale husband barely managed to hold her by the shoulders. "I thought, well, it's better for you to know the truth," the nurse continued. "After all, you're his parents. Otherwise, you would have started searching, hired detectives, hoped for years, and then you would have found out anyway." "Thank you for the truth," Eleanor Thompson squeezed out. "It really is better this way." "How can we live now?" "Yes, I understand, it's hard," the old woman agreed. "But you have to live. You're not to blame for anything. The little boy was sick. Without treatment, it would have happened even earlier in your family. And Arthur had a good life here. Everyone loved him. The boy was very kind and affectionate and smart, too." The couple drove home in silence. Eleanor Thompson understood that the nurse was right. Arthur had been doomed from birth. But she couldn't help blaming herself for being cowardly then. Even if her son had lived less, he would have been surrounded by loving relatives, not strangers. The woman understood. This guilt would now stay with her forever, and nothing could atone for it. Of course, the couple didn't tell Claire anything. Arthur remained a great secret. Even with each other, the couple never spoke about their son and his fate again. It was too scary, too difficult. But they couldn't help but think about him, of course. Not a day passed without Eleanor Thompson remembering her little boy. She secretly prayed for him, lit candles in church, and constantly reproached herself for her faint-heartedness. The realization that nothing could be changed now weighed heavily on her. To her own surprise, Eleanor Thompson gradually got used to this life. The feeling of guilt became a part of her personality, without which the woman could no longer imagine herself. Her daughter grew up and went to study in London, then got a job there, settled in the capital. She was no longer nearby, which saddened her parents, but at the same time, they were proud of Claire's success and were ready to accept her departure, as long as their girl was happy. Eleanor Thompson had recently retired. Her husband was still working. The workshop in the garage had turned into a large furniture factory, and Eleanor Thompson's husband was a department head there, a big shot with a solid salary. He liked his job. The woman suspected that work allowed her husband to distract himself from sad thoughts. Eleanor Thompson finally immersed herself in housekeeping. She had worked her whole life, and there wasn't enough time for the house. But now their apartment was perfectly tidy, and the table groaned with culinary masterpieces. It turned out that caring for loved ones was a pleasant pastime, not a heavy duty, as it had seemed before. True, there weren't enough people to care for now, just her husband and their unpretentious cat, Whiskers. But Eleanor Thompson was still happy. She dreamed of grandchildren whom her daughter would bring to Grandma and Grandpa for holidays. Oh, she would spoil them rotten, Claire's children. Soon, very soon, little ones would appear in Eleanor Thompson's life, in addition to the already beloved Timmy and Lily. The snow crunched loudly underfoot and sparkled beautifully in the light of the street lamps. Here was the right house. They were waiting for her there. Timmy would rush to hug her from the doorstep and, of course, immediately bombard her with questions. He would probably ask about the train, about the journey. They met Eleanor Thompson warmly. A set table awaited in the living room, and the aromas of delicious pastries wafted from the kitchen. The evening was warm, heartfelt, and cheerful. Eleanor Thompson enjoyed talking with David and Emily, listening to new funny stories about the little ones. And yes, life with such tiny ones simply couldn't be boring. The young parents looked a little tired, but very happy. Our family became complete thanks to Timmy, Emily admitted. With his arrival, I realized that this is exactly the kind of boy we were missing. David looked at his wife with tenderness and love. It was obvious that he was grateful to her for her attitude towards his son. Yes, the man was truly lucky. People like Emily were a rarity after all. And then Eleanor Thompson played with Timmy and Lily, built towers out of blocks, had a tea party for dolls, and spent a long time rocking the children on the indoor swing, enjoying their ringing laughter. And before bed, she read the little ones a fairy tale. Both listened with interest to every word, even tiny Lily. She was in a wonderfully imitative age now, trying to repeat everything her brother did, like a little monkey. Afterward, Eleanor Thompson lay on the sofa in the guest room assigned to her and smiled. The household, tired from the day's chores and impressions, were asleep. The wall clock ticked in the apartment, sleepy, quiet, peaceful. Eleanor Thompson was used to being tormented by thoughts of Arthur before sleep. She tried to imagine his life in the orphanage, without parental love and affection, wondered if he was mistreated by the caregivers or the other children. All this was terribly burdensome, preventing her from feeling joy. But now for some reason, it was easier. Memories of the terrible mistake no longer caused such mental anguish. Timmy had miraculously healed the old wounds. No, Eleanor Thompson did not absolve herself of guilt. She still felt heartbreakingly sorry for the son who had such a difficult fate. A poor, abandoned, sick boy. But the woman finally decided to tell her daughter everything. Claire, of course, was shocked. For a while, Claire just blinked silently and tried to catch her breath. So stunned was she by the suddenly revealed secret. But her daughter did not turn away from her parents, as Eleanor Thompson had imagined all these years. On the contrary, she pitied them, accepted this terrible choice, even supported them. "How do you live with such a heavy burden on your soul?" Claire whispered, hugging her mother and father. "But you were young, confused, and frightened, and no one supported you, my poor dears." Yes, the tragedy with Arthur would forever remain with Eleanor Thompson. But now, life had become much easier. She had been given a chance to save a child so wonderfully similar to her son, and she had done it. Now Timmy was in a loving family, and joy and peace reigned in Eleanor Thompson's soul.